Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for 360 Feedback Best Practices to Fuel Success. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll take care of a few housekeeping items and do introductions. I'm Jessie Bueringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function throughout the presentation. We'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end in a Q&A session. Joining me to discuss 360 Feedback Best Practice is 3D Group President Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is the founder of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose is an author and co-editor of the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. He's also a fellow of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. In addition to designing custom 360 feedback systems for clients, Dr. Rose personally coaches leaders in focused post 360 feedback sessions. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first line supervisor. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CEO World, and HR.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dale, to get us started.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all for joining me today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, 360 feedback. I'll be spending the day today going through, I'm going to start off with a little bit of basics just to make sure we're sort of all on the same page and around what 360 is and how it's used. I'll do that pretty quickly, and then I'll dive into some of our research on, what are those best practices and what are current practices as well. I'll be embedding some data from our current benchmark study, which will help perhaps illustrate some points around how people have approached doing 360 feedback. I always like to start with the bottom line. So, people, particularly executives, are often interested in, is there value in this tool? What is that value? We've done a little bit of research looking at this. This particular study we did was in a retail setting where we were able to take 65 big box retail managers data, split that group in half, and find that really the high scorers were the ones that were driving sales. There were some controls put in here. So, bottom line, we do know that the better leaders score better. They do better on these assessments. And so if you're helping develop people on these areas and helping them see where their blind spots are, that's going to be driving sales at the end of the day. A considerably more rigorous study was done with 253 companies, a meta-analysis across all these different companies, identifying what were the financial impacts. Journal of Applied Psychology is the top of the stack, so this is a pretty well done study, and their basic conclusion was that indeed 360s did positively predict productivity. So again, some bottom line impact on what 360 feedback can do for the workforce. We also have looked at our own data. As I mentioned, we have a benchmarking study. Our most recent, the 8th edition, was just released this year. We've been doing this for a number of years, and what we've basically done in this study is looked at, well, if you're designing a 360 process, what questions would you need? What design considerations would you need to consider? And what are people currently doing? It's a real useful tool. If you haven't seen it or don't have a copy, I recommend it. Very helpful for designing your own 360 and communicating internally about why you might be making the choices that you're making. A lot of data points in there. One of the data points, again, driving to the bottom line, has to do with, well, what are people's views around the metrics that 360 drives, and what we hear companies say, and this has actually been the same a couple years running now, is that 360s really help drive better decision making for leaders. It gives them critical information for making decisions, certainly development decisions, I think, but also if you look at using 360s in a performance context, there's certainly relevance there. And then, of course, we know that high potentials really, really thrive in a high feedback environment and get pretty frustrated when they don't have access to feedback to how they're doing and what they can do better. That's kind of a key element of a high potential. So we know that 360s are a critical tool for elevating high potentials and keeping them engaged and retained. So I do like to hit, and then these are kind of the basics. I do like to hit on what are we talking about when we talk about 360s. When we talk to folks, we hear all different versions of what 360 feedback is. So I'll do this quickly. I'm sure most of our audience is familiar, but it's good to do a little bit of level setting. So, why 360 feedback? Well, typically, you get one, right? Your manager is going to be one of these four people. Which one would you want? I don't know about you, but I'm sort of wanting the one on the upper left. But if you happen to draw any of the other three, and all of your progression and your development and your workplace success is really heavily dictated by this one individual, that's pretty rough. You want to know how you can do better. That one person's perspective may not have the whole message in it. So of course, 360 feedback was developed to get beyond that. And so I love this graphic because I think it illustrates a number of key points. So first off, you've got the feedback recipient. Back in the 90s, they were feedback targets. Thankfully, we've moved beyond that. But you're getting feedback. This person's getting feedback from multiple different sources who all have different perspectives. So you can look at the peer perspective as a holistic notion. Direct reports. How do my direct reports see me is critical. And then, of course, this other group could be anything. One of the interesting things is that we typically, we'll see an average score, try to understand what's that peer perspective or that direct report perspective or the other perspective. But take a look at the other group, for example. And the key interesting point here is that it's not really a unified view, right? There's that guy on the lower left seems to have a pretty different perspective than the person just above him. So I think one of the things to look at is not just how do these different groups see this individual, but is there variation within that? And so that just comes to a little bit about how you process and work with the data. It's useful to see the whole, again, your whole view of your direct reports, but the variability is also important. So what this gives us is a much more complex, much more nuanced understanding of how a leader's behavior is showing up in the workplace. It's not their intention, it's not their personality, it's not what they tend toward, it's how they actually show up. So when we think about kind of what 360 is at its core, my colleagues and I have kind of gone on record as defining 360 in these three core areas. So the first is it's a quantitative survey. It is not interviews. Stakeholder interviews are incredibly valuable in a leadership development context, but they're not the same for a variety of reasons. Which, if you want to read the article, we go in depth at this. But the importance of the quantitative survey, the high level is you can actually compare those different groups, kind of apples to apples. Everyone gets asked all the same questions. These are things that don't happen in an interview. The other thing is it needs to be related to relevant workplace behavior, meaning survey items that are contextually relevant for that organization at that point in time. And then obviously multiple feedback sources, not just that single perspective. So if you've got all these things, we're going to be thinking about it from as a 360 tool. And again, some of it's just nomenclature around interviews, et cetera. But I think when you're thinking about 360s, you really do want to be thinking about surveys. There are a lot of advantages to this. So what does that actually look like? Well, the surveys ought to be on related to behaviors. So for example, the behavior here would be listens to others attentively, and it's rated on a rating scale from, in this case, 1 to 5 with a don't know, not applicable. A bunch of different ways to report results. There's a million of them. This is just a simple example where you could get average scores for each group, which doesn't give you the variability within the group that I talked about before, but you can do a few little tricks. So you might notice, for example, the direct report number there is italicized, which suggests that one of those direct reports rated a 1 or a 2. So there's a way that you can kind of get at some of those differences and try to understand the nuances. But at the end of the day, this is really what we're talking about. This is kind of our level set. So who uses 360 feedback? Very simple org chart here, just to kind of give a sense. These are really the I guess really 4 different buckets. We see that it's really mostly a management or leadership tool, but there are organizations that use these for individual contributors, sometimes at the just, the sort of, high powered, high influence individual contributors. But often, many organizations will actually use 360s in a census environment where everyone's getting feedback on a cadence. So pretty clearly focused though primarily on leaders, and again at multiple levels. This is not an executive only tool. Um, so how does it work? The core underlying element for 360 feedback is self-awareness, right? It's, are you aware of how you are seen? So it puts up a mirror in many ways. And, some people will look at the little slobber drippy thing as a good thing and cute and adorable, and others will think, oh, gee, glad I saw that. I'm going to wipe it off. What's interesting about 360 feedback and self-awareness, though, is that just looking at yourself in a mirror, there could be different versions of what that mirror looks like. So, for example, think for a moment about this apple, and let's say we're trying to rate performance, if you will, rate behavior. How would you rate this apple? Scale from 1 to 10. 10 being looks like a delicious apple. Would love to eat this apple, and 1 being this is going right into the compost bin. So, what's your rating? Well, the important thing to recognize is that your rating here is based on a number of things. Of course, it's two-dimensional. You're not actually holding the apple, etc. But you also have a particular angle on the apple. If we were to rotate that apple, you might rate it slightly differently. So I think the key element for 360 feedback is that people from multiple perspectives have different views, and being able to surface those to understand your behavior is critical. We see this most often, well, but very often with kind of leaders and individuals who manage up really well, but don't manage down very well. So their leaders think, oh man, that person's a real go-getter. And their direct reports think, wow, this person ignores me, chastises me when I don't deserve it, and doesn't give me any support. Okay, that's a very different perspective. But the other thing to recognize is that awareness is not really enough, right? So this leader undoubtedly is aware that she may be holding on to some things that she should pass to others, that she's a little bit of a bottleneck, but she hasn't changed her behavior. So you need to really add in this component of acceptance, right? This person's not going to change their behavior until they accept, okay, this is something I need to work on. So being aware, not quite enough. Now, when you put uh, behavior change and 360 into kind of a model to understand how it flows, what you see is that we do have this notion of awareness. We're going to create a plan to create change, and then that's going to lead to the change that we want. But as I mentioned, the key components that are missing here are both actually awareness and accountability. So you need to build a process in such a way that you're not just giving people the view, hey, here's the mirror. You're also get building in elements of that process that will help them accept that this is something they need and want to change. Give them a mechanism for creating a plan to change, and then hold them accountable for it. These are the key components that any 360 process needs to have in order to get that ROI that we're looking for. So how do you get started? When you really dig into it, I mean, certainly there's a first question here that pops in. Well, who wants to get feedback? This is often the first one that comes up. Sometimes it's, oh, that person needs feedback. But hopefully it's a little bit more systemic, and you're thinking about your organization broadly and talent management, et cetera. And then you start into it, and lots of other questions start to pop up very quickly. So designing the process gets to be pretty complex, and also very can get fairly political. So I think having data points, having structure, having kind of methodologies that you use, and referencing what others have done can be very helpful to shaping this. Of course, you need to consider your own context, your own culture, your own purpose. When we think about what you're ultimately trying to do, though, it really does come down to behavior change, right? So if you're trying to help people change their behavior for the better, what are those elements that you need to kind of include in that design? Well, the first one I would say is don't overlook content, right? So, what are the behaviors that leaders need to exhibit to be successful in your organization? And if you look at our book on strategic 360 feedback, what that should be defined in is the context around your business strategy. So, what behaviors do your leaders need to exhibit in order to achieve the strategy that you have before you? And can you create clear, actionable behaviors that are relevant to that context to give people feedback on? So that's absolutely number one. Make sure you're giving it, clear, relevant feedback. Uh, you also have to get credible data. So frequently, well, not frequently, occasionally, a leader will look at their feedback. I've actually seen this done before, where they look at the report and they say, "Gee, all the wrong raters filled this out." I only got my worst, my worst performing direct reports. Only the peers that really dislike me filled it out, and my manager didn't even complete it. So how much motivation does this person now have to change? The data aren't credible. So you need to make sure you've got enough and the correct raters in there. And then, of course, as we know, there needs to be anonymity. So you have to give people the ability to be truly, truly honest about what they see as opportunities for growth in that leader. So these, again, designing around these components, making sure that rater selection, ideally with rater approval, so you've got the right raters, but then also there are mechanisms to ensure anonymity. And then we talked before about accountability. The two elements for that that I most recommend are providing some amount of feedback coaching, even just an hour of, what are you going to do with your data? But then importantly, I was actually just talking to a leader yesterday about the importance of not just accountability, but sustainability of behavior change. And honestly, that's where the manager comes into play. There's no app that's really going to do this for you. You really need that manager holding someone accountable for their development and doing that in a sustained way over a period of time. Again, there's a large sort of desire to try to technologize this and make it a some sort of an app or some sort of a dashboard people have to go check boxes in. At the end of the day, I think that manager feedback is really what is the most critical. So these are the kind of underlying concepts that you want to drive into any bit of design. But let me jump in and try to give you and boil it down to kind of six top things to think about as the key design pieces that you want to include, if you will, my six best practices. So the first is around purpose and context. So you want to make sure that you're clear about purpose. So why are you doing this 360? What is it for? What do you hope to get out of it? What do you hope leaders get out of it? When in our benchmark study, we asked companies, how is the 360 feedback process used? Clearly, we found development is kind of the top of that list. If you look at the first few of these, the career development, development broadly, I'll point out this little salmon line that I've got colored in here. This is what we call the historical winner, right? So across all the times that we've asked this question over the last many years, if you average those all out, this is the one that most people agree on. But clearly development is key. And then all the way down at the bottom, direct link to pay increases, not recommended. Um, People will start gaming the system. It's just not likely to work particularly well. But using it as a diagnostic for development, using it for succession planning, identifying your hypos. These are things that are commonly enough used and recommended. But at the core, the bottom line is that it needs to be about development. But you also in that setting need to consider kind of the big picture. So you know what does it look like across the company, and how does it link to your strategy? Can you message and make clear that these behaviors do link to your strategy and how that happens? How have you communicated? I think we see where we see companies struggle is when they don't communicate out. They don't, in a sense, get control of the message of why are we doing this? What are we doing it for? What do we hope you get out of it? And then what ends up happening is that the process will gain a reputation where people will start to read between the lines and try to figure out for themselves why it's used. And they almost always come up with very off color, off base reasons. Oh, this is what they use right before they fire you. Oh, you're getting a 360. Oh, that's just horrible. Like they come up with their own versions of it, which is likely not the intent or the design that you've put into place. So a communication plan and being really active around that is super, super important, and particularly kind of from the top down. And then you want to ask yourself, are you focused on individual change? Is this really just an opportunity to get a couple of leaders or a few dozen leaders some of their individual development? Or are you also looking to really change the organization writ large in that sort of strategic 360 structure that I was talking about? There will be different design decisions based on how you answer these questions. So knowing them up front will be very, very important. The second sort of key driver, key practice is make sure that you've got senior level support, right? Try to get support from as high up the organization as you can. What we find is that largely the C suite is very supportive of 360 feedback. They understand how it works, they've used it themselves. They see how it can impact an organization and individual leaders. So we see that there is quite a bit of support there. It's not surprising that, the chief learning officer and CHRO at the top of this list, but recognize you've got 80% support from CEOs. So all the way to the top of the house, they're not going to be designing it. Although we do have one case where CEO is literally designing a report. um, I've said before, CEOs write the worst survey items. They just tend to think very dynamically and not clear and boiled down. They may have that big picture. They may contribute extremely well to your competency model. But when it comes to actually writing behaviors, that you want a professional involved in, because survey items can be notoriously difficult to interpret when they're poorly written. And then not surprised that the CFO tends to be a little bit more um, scrutinizing and skeptical, I would say generally, it's an overgeneralization, but generally of talent management practices, will, still be supportive, but less so in that room, if you will. So whatever you can do to get and to broadcast, when I was talking about the communication, that senior level support, highly recommended. I mentioned before the importance of content. I think too often content gets overlooked. If you think about content, it's really critical from the perspective of culture. So this is one of my favorite quotes about culture, which is around the notion that the behavior that leaders tolerate, uh, encourage, and engage in themselves model is what culture is. And so 360 becomes a very, very powerful tool to drive culture, particularly if you use it across the organization. So if you think about these couple of items here, seeks opportunities for process improvements or makes transformational changes to benefit the business. If you're expecting your leaders to do one of these two things, and you're evaluating leaders across the entire company on one of these two things, you can see how the organization will be different based on the choice you make. And the other choice is to not even include this at all, right? So in both cases, you're looking for innovation, you're looking for process improvement, you're looking for improved efficiencies, uh, but in but they're quite different in the culture that they're setting, right? It's like, yes, I'm constantly tweaking and finding better ways versus, no, I'm really redesigning and making this significantly better to drive our business. And I'm expected to do that. And by the way, every leader is expected to be thinking that way. Just changes the way people interact. So when you think about, how do you do this? How do you build it? I'm, didn't mean to disparage CEOs completely. They can be very critical for designing the direction and the content at a high level. It's just at the item writing level that's where you run into trouble. So, as a matter of fact, this card sort right here, this was taken. There was literally a CEO on the other side of this table, helping kind of think through what are the big picture behaviors that are needed for this organization. So how you go about it, what we find is that custom surveys are really quite common. Three-quarters of companies are using custom surveys, and again, in this effort to drive culture and make them content specific. But off-the-shelf tools can be useful for their own purpose, right? Particularly if you're focused, for example, on individual level behavior in a couple of different folks. Off-the-shelf tools can be extremely useful and certainly more practical to develop or to use because you're not having to build a whole development cycle in front of your 360 process. So it's kind of quicker to launch. So when we unpack that custom group, though, we find there's a real mix in terms of who is doing this. Is this just an external consultant doing it? Is it just an internal group or committee, or is it kind of a blend of the two? And really, this is just what's going to work best for your organization. But I would say you do want some measurement expertise in that group, regardless of whether they're internal or external. The example I use, and this is really the challenge with the CEO, they haven't been taught about double-barreled items. They haven't looked at what impact certain item structures have on psychometrics. So having someone who can support that in writing the content is gonna get you much better data, both from a rater experience standpoint and an interpretation standpoint. All right, so when you're building that content out, how big of a survey should it be? Back in the 90s, the PDI, I think, used to have surveys that were in the like 135 item, 22 competencies. Not so much anymore. So really our advice is 70 questions or less. 70 questions, well written, can be completed in about 6 to 8 minutes, including a little bit of time for open-ended comments. Open-ended comments can take a long time to write. But 70 questions, you'd be surprised how quickly that can be done. And that could cover, a dozen or so competencies pretty accurately from a reliability standpoint. So our data sort of showed this is about right. And that sort of 40 is probably your mode in here in terms of what survey length is. I think when you get down to the 1 to 20, you're going to likely lose a lot of the depth and richness in a leadership model. So I would be a little careful under 20. 40, I think, is probably about your sweet spot if you're looking for short. But you do need at least 3 items per competency to have a reliable measure, and even 3 is a little small. 5 is better. So that ends up 8 competencies. You end up around 40 items and for a smaller survey. So that seems reasonable. And then when we averaged it out, we came up with 44. So this is kind of what's done out there, but again, every organization is going to be different. Another key question that was in my options, around the sort of the stool, the foundations, if you will, has to do with the integrity of the data itself and credibility. And so probably one of the biggest drivers of credibility, certainly I talked about raters before, but anonymity. Anonymity is just central to the process. And um, actually, there's a chapter in our book that does a good job of really identifying this more as confidentiality because someone's going to know, but you're ideally the vendor that's running your surveys has some an ethical code of conduct that where they won't share identified information. I think it's super important. And so people responding to the survey need to trust that their answer, they can say what they really feel. They can say what they see. There won't be any repercussions. They won't be identified. The individual receiving the feedback will not see who said what is the simplest way to think about it. And indeed, 3/4 of our companies said that they felt anonymity was essential. Without it, not going to work. Probably the key, most common way of protecting anonymity has to do with, well, first of all, you certainly don't attach names to specific ratings, but also when you're reporting data out, you have to be careful just to state the obvious. If you only had one person from, say, your peer group respond and you report those data, well, you know who said what. Uh, when we look at how many individuals are typically included, what we find is that 3 is kind of the most common. It's the mode here. So a minimum of 3, in my example, peers averaged together gives you that anonymity. 2, it starts to get a little too easy to figure out. 1, obvious. 4 is great, even better, more anonymity. 5, even better. The challenge is you run into practical realities that not everybody has 4 or 5 direct reports or peers that are going to respond to that survey. Um, and so 3 tends to be kind of that practical, but also reasonable threshold to hold on to. What I really can't figure out is this group. No minimum at all. Obviously, you've got people reporting with just one. Clearly, there's no anonymity here, and I think it's important that your survey really should identify for when the person's filling the survey out what is that threshold. So we actually have in all of our surveys we call it the kind of the rules of engagement. We write in there your data will not be reported unless at least 3 people respond. So they understand what the threshold is and they can make their own judgment about what they feel comfortable with. So anonymity is huge. The sixth and final best practice I'm gonna flag here is important and not necessarily seen as important all the time when people are thinking about surveys and reports and response rates, which is where a lot of the energy comes in. But feedback coaching, and not necessarily, I'm not talking here about executive coaching. Executive coaching is fine and good, but really a feedback coach, somebody who can coach you through your feedback and help come up with, what do I do about it? What is my plan here? What am I going to do with this feedback? Super, super important to getting that actual change that you're looking for. Coaches in an hour can get people to really prioritize their development. I emphasize this from a coaching perspective, not a debriefing. So this, it's not horrible to have someone read through your report, but your report ought to be clear enough that someone can read it on their own. They don't really need someone to read it through with them. The question is, after you've read it, after that leader's read it, what did they take away? What are those key priorities for development? What do you do with it in context? And that's what a good feedback session should really get somebody through, is to identify those 1 to 3 areas. We see that, since we've been doing this 23 years ago, this has been a critical component, not just, and this is the graphic, thank you, Jesse, not just icing on the cake, right? It really is, it turns out, a critical component. And in fact, 4 out of 5 companies recommend coaching as an essential component to a 360 process. So, thinking about how someone's going to get the support they need to really translate it into change is important. Now, I recognize when you go to scale, this can be a little tricky, and there may be other ways to approach it. But it is important to make sure someone's supported and that there is some sort of, what do I do with this? How do I boil it down? A lot of different ways to slice that. You can, frankly, managers can be trained to support this process. You can get, a video that helps someone think it through a little bit. It won't be specific to their own feedback, but it's at least scalable and it helps them kind of orient around the feedback. So a lot of ways you can do this when you go to scale, but highly recommended. So just to kind of recap, and I've gone through this a little bit quickly by design. I have to thank you all. The quality and the number of questions that we got coming in to this webinar were just exceptional. So I want to leave some time to kind of go through those, because I think you took the time to ask the questions and they were really great. So I want to make sure I take the time to answer them. But first, let me do a recap, and then I've got a couple of other key points. So as I said, clear about purpose, communicate it broadly, get that senior leader support. That should be where you get that a lot of the communication. Make sure the content is relevant to people's roles, and ideally in a context that it's the culture you're trying to drive. Make the survey a reasonable length to both measure accurately and get people to complete it. We typically run surveys 40 to 70 questions and get 88, 90% response rate. So it's definitely, very doable if the questions are built correctly. Uh, Make sure you've messaged anonymity and you've built in structures to assure that people's feedback is anonymous or at least confidential. And make sure that there's some mechanism for, what do I do with this support on the back end, ideally that feedback coaching. Just quickly, we also ask companies like, what do you think 360, are you going to be doing more of this or less? Is this, as my advisor told me 30 years ago, a passing fad, not not looking like it. Three-quarters of companies see themselves doing the same or more with bigger and or similar budgets. All right, and I'm going to throw one little just random one in here at the end, because it's the question on everyone's mind over and over and over again. How is AI incorporated into 360s? So we did in fact ask people, are you using AI? And basically no. But we, of course, also asked those 5% that said yes. Well, gee, that's interesting. How are you using it? Really boiled down to two different things. Uh, the few using it to analyze group results, and then some using it to support survey development. So there's a little bit of work. I think, again, group level results, just like an org survey, if you have, 800 leaders that all have open-ended comments, it's pretty hard to make sense of that. Boy, an AI can cut through those comments really fast. And then, on survey development, just like a CEO, don't let your AI write your items. They won't be good. But they might give you an idea of content coverage. So I think there's a way to say, oh, right, I should cover that area that I hadn't thought of. It's the phrase I've heard that I really like is, AI is not taking your job, but if you're not using AI, then someone who is using AI will take your job. So use it to support, but it's not the end all be all. At the end of the day, what people care most about is what their colleagues are saying, not what an AI says their colleagues might be saying. Okay, so that's what I've got. Before we get to your questions, I think, Jesse, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you had a couple of things before, and you've also got the questions to ask me. So,
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dale. If you want to hit the next slide, Dale, I just wanted to let you all know we have a great event coming up that I want to invite you to. So twice a year, we host this unique peer learning event. It's called the Strategic 360 Feedback Forum. Companies get together to share their current 360 practices, challenges, and successes, and get the opportunity to connect with their peers. It's a different format. We don't record it. It's very much more interactive and discussion based. So you can really just talk to other people in companies like yours and find out what they're doing and get their input. At this particular event coming up on June 3rd, the 360 expert Alan Church, who's really fantastic, is going to be joining us talking about his recent work creating business aligned custom 360 processes. So this is sort of a don't miss one. The event is open to internal practitioners that have an active 360 feedback process. I'm going to send out the slides after today, so you all will have the link. We'd hope to see many of you there. We think it's going to be a really fantastic event. Uh, and with that, I'm going to share some of those questions that you asked at registration. We still have time if you have also like a burning question that you came up with while Dale was talking and we were patiently waiting to the end. Feel free to put that into the Q&A and chat as well. The first few that we had a few questions, Dale. I know you hit on this a little bit about using the process for development versus performance. So Lucy asked, can you make a stronger distinction between why you should use a 360 for development and not performance issues? So maybe not,
yeah,
there's
yeah.
sort of two different things in there, right? There's like using it for performance management, and then there's also using it for performance issues is sort of what I'm
Yeah,
hearing
yeah,
too.
yeah. I wanted to flag that. Right. I love the way you put that, Lucy. Thank you. Great, great question. A question that's been asked for decades, by the way, but still is germane. I think the key is exactly what the way you framed it is to make sure that you're clear on your purpose. Chapter 3 in our book does a very comprehensive job of describing the elements that you would need to put in place to use 360s for performance management well. It's written by Emily Campion and her brother and her dad, brilliant, brilliant IS psychologists. And I highly recommend it if you're looking at that. The bottom line is 360s can be used as a component of performance management when they're done well, and an organization is comfortable with the methodology and the process, and again, lots of communication. Lawyers are going to be involved to make sure the process is defensible, et cetera. Um, I would say, so there literally, I think, are 52 elements. So I'm not going to go through all those 52 elements. What's interesting is when Cindy McCauley out of CCL, who is notorious, CCL is notorious for a development only point of view, read through those. She said, well, these performance management criteria are all the same that you would put in for development. So in a sense, I think for either one, you just need a really well developed, reliable, valid process and tool, and they should be for either. So the decisions that you're making there, the decision about where should this leader develop or where should this group of leaders develop, very expensive decision. So that ought to be done correctly. um, I would say, if I look at the differences though, so there are things like a development only process. You probably are not sharing the report with the person's manager. We actually recommend that the person's manager get at least a summary of what the person's going to work on that came out of the report, ideally with maybe a coach review of that to make sure it lines up. There's some accountability. But if you're a manager and you have 6 direct reports and you're looking through all of their feedback, it's just too much. It's not a useful use of their time. So I would, that's probably one of the biggest ones is do you give people access to the reports? But I would say in both cases you need accountability around taking action. The one thing I wouldn't do is I wouldn't use it for performance issues. Okay, so just to use your language, where we see it go really awry is when people, oh, that person's having problems. Let's give them a 360. That's not going to help. You need to really give 360s to people who you want to invest in out of the gate, or if you're using it for everybody as part of your performance management process. But I would not use it for performance issues. Hopefully that was a clear enough answer to make the distinction. Yeah.
So, sort of funny enough, related to that, Sarah just wrote in, is it acceptable to replace an individual's annual review with a 360 review for that year? This was a hot
Hmm.
topic, what, I don't know, 7 to 10 years ago, maybe more recently, like
And
the
it still
annual
comes up
review
as
is
Sarah points
dying, right?
out. Yeah, yeah. The annual review is not dying. Its demise is greatly exaggerated. I think turned out like 6% of companies actually went that route, and then most of them went back. Um, for good reason. I would no, you should not replace a real review with a 360. I think where we see 360s used is for a couple things. A, to identify what's your development focus for the next year? Like, what is that development goal? That component of a performance management process, super, super critical. And then it can inform various aspects of something that a manager is seeing as a development area. But at the end of the day, it's the judgment of someone's manager about what that person needs to be doing in the next, say, 12 months and where they need to be focusing and where they need to develop and grow and how they've done in the last 6 months. Those are really judgment issues by a manager that are going to be contextualized to the individual. So I would not replace it. I would augment or include a 360 as part of performance management process. But you should never be in a situation where, for example, if you get X score, then you get X overall rating, and therefore you get X raise. That's or Y raise. That's not. I would not do that.
Okay, Charlene had a $1 million question here. How to create a culture where feedback is sought and embraced organically?
Yeah, it's funny. We have a very visible large client right now where actually it was at the Strategic 360 Forum where we met them. Their CHRO was very adamant that that was the goal. Like, we don't need 360s. We just need to be better at giving each other feedback and be honest and direct. And people should handle that and use it constructively. And she was right. That would be ideal. And yet, here we are. We're humans and we don't do that. And it's difficult and it's threatening if you're in a position. Speaking to power can be very challenging if somebody's in a vulnerable place. And so, and yet, we know that people have access to visibility. They see other sides of that apple. And that's important for people to hear and understand, for leaders to hear and understand. So 360s, I think, create an opportunity for that. and they also build muscle memory. So I guess what I would say is that 360s can start creating an environment where feedback is just part of what we do, and then it makes it easier for that informal, infrequent or frequent feedback to happen. So I see it as like actually a 360 is kind of propping up and helping support that more so than supplanting it, and that's what we've seen time and time again. So I guess what I would say is building in a regular cadence every year, every other year on a 360 gives people the muscle memory in the company to be doing that. And they recognize that feedback is valued by leaders because leaders are getting the feedback and then responding to it. It's just a great way to help people get good at it. And so I would see this as the support to make what you're talking about happen.
The next one is, what recommendations do you have, Dale, around survey and participant fatigue?
Uh, We give people a 2-week window to complete surveys. The surveys are quick and easy to fill out. So items are things like admits mistakes, follows through on commitments, listens attentively. This is like easy, right? It's not a big long sentence that you get to the end and you go, wait, what was this again? And you have to reread it. That's your CEO item, right? So make sure the surveys are clear and concise. Make sure the rating scales are clean. 5-point rating scale is ideal. Uh, Only two, maybe three, but really two is usually enough open-ended questions because that's where most of the time is taken. And then allow people the opportunity to decline a survey. So sometimes someone will get invited to a survey and like, I don't even know this person, or I barely know this person. And if they can decline, they just know I'm not going to give valid feedback. So I'm just going to not fill the survey out. If they can decline and they don't keep getting reminders to fill surveys out on that person that they're not going to do, then they can reorient their time and energy toward ones that they're going to give good, valid feedback to. What I don't recommend, and I do see, and the technologists can do it, so they put it out there and it looks all widgety and cool, is that don't let the computer decide how many surveys to fill out, right? So there's this application people will do where, oh yeah, nobody gets more than 10 surveys to complete because we're managing survey fatigue. And then it turns out that they open it up and they go, well, I barely know these 10 people. But the 10 people that didn't get included on the list because the computer decided to cut it at the first 10, those are ones they really should have given feedback to that would have been great. So let the person get 20 and realize, like, okay, I'm not doing all these 20. I'm going to do the 5 that I'm going to be really good at. And let that be the way that people sort of manage their own fatigue. um, Let people be adults, I guess. And then also you can manage, so we'll do like if you're doing a census implementation across an entire organization, you can chunk the surveys out so that you're doing them monthly cohorts. So it's not like everybody, like it's not one 360 cycle where everybody I work with I have to fill surveys out, but like every month or every quarter I get a cluster that I'm doing, and so people go through alphabetically or by division and that kind of thing. So there's a couple ideas.
Great, thank you. Carolina asked sort of a two-part question, how to get participants to feel comfortable and have psychological safety, the process, and how to get them to get the most out of it.
Yeah, so I mean, psychological safety, trust in, the anonymity piece is the key to emphasize, and a lot of that goes to communicating purpose, communicating it from the top, making sure that you get that minimum of 3 in there. I will say we've worked with a lot of companies where they have we start with kind of a low trust environment and they're sort of tentative. What tends to happen is that they will sort of dip their toes in and they're okay, I'll try this. Their ratings might inflate a little bit just to kind of hedge and be sure. And then when they get they get through that first cycle, they realize, oh, actually nothing happened here. And so that was bad. In fact, some good things happened. So then next time around, those scores actually go down a little bit because people are a little more forthcoming and people think, oh my God, our leaders got worse. No, no, your raters just got more careful. So I think some of it is just repeat helps because people get experience with it and people have all kinds of wildly different experiences with 360s, sometimes being used vindictively and things like that. in other companies. So it makes sense that they need to sort of see it here to see, is this really good or is this being used for ill? Um, the communication piece, the other one is to start from the top, right? So if you're at the top of the organization, if you cascade all the way down, then it's not like this is being done to target people or get people at the bottom of the organization. People are leading with courage and actually participating, and they can demonstrate how to use it. One of the most important things is for a leader, after they get feedback, to go back to the people that gave them feedback and thank them and tell them what they're doing with it. Now I can understand how this is being used. But it's probably, if you're in a low trust environment, the most important thing is to do that first implementation, double down on you're the only one that gets the report. No one else is going to see this. Get people comfortable with it. And then the next go around, it will sort of slowly get more, a little bit more and more comfort, a little bit more and more teeth, and people will start using it better. I remember working, for some reason, this is reminding me of working with one leader where she had invited like all of her closest friends at work, right? Like everybody that she just liked, because she just wanted to see, you know, get good scores. And when she got the feedback, she was so disappointed at how high her scores were. She really realized, oh man, I missed an opportunity because of course these people rated me high. I didn't get anything useful out of this. Which contrasts to another leader I worked with one time that invited all the, like, literally 30 people that she thought were just absolutely had it out for her. And she was thrilled at her scores that were in the like mid low twos, which I thought were going to have her in tears. So I think, yeah, there's an opportunity there to just think through, um, giving people a little bit of experience. In both cases, well, in the first case, the second time around, she picked better raters and she got varied data and had a very rich experience, but she just didn't feel safe enough to do it the first time.
Thankswell asked, what are some common mistakes organizations make when rolling out 360 feedback, and how should it be delivered to avoid defensiveness?
Yeah, I mean, the feedback coaching is really helpful for defensiveness. That's usually, you're getting acceptance is like one of the number one things that a feedback coach can do in an hour, is to get people to just accept their feedback and, oh no, you actually have something valuable here you can work with. Um, so that desk drop, you just give them the reports and hope for the best. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes. Making sure they've got some sort of support on the back end, very important. Let's see, other key mistakes that I see people make. Yeah, the content again can be a problem. So just, oh, I'm just going to write this myself, or um, uh, using a model that's overly complex, and then that feeds into a report that's really hard to read. I guess that's the other big one, is reports that are overly complicated to read. It just shouldn't be that complicated to understand. It's an emotional enough experience to get a report on feedback. So, make it as simple as you can. And some of these, I mean, the technologists, again, like they've oh, we can report data this way and this way and this way, and they put little complicated, variability indices and all these kinds of things. And then it requires a coach to sit there and explain the way the report was calculated, and the person doesn't get any time on development. So I just make the report as simple and clear as you can. Um, mm, Yeah, not communicating. I would say the biggest thing really is communicate, like have a communications plan across the organization about why we're doing this, what it is, who's going to get access to the data. Like communicate so there's clarity and that people understand what your purpose is. I would say that's the one that runs, because otherwise, again, the reputation shifts in all these warped ways. And you're like, that's not what we meant at all. But it's because you spent all your time designing the survey and the report and forgot to tell people why you were doing it.
Okay, I'm going to throw one more out there and then we'll wrap maybe with a couple of minutes left.
Hmm.
What role should HR or team leads play? That's kind of a big question. What is the role of HR?
Depends a little on the organization about how you've positioned your HR business partners. Are they strategy? Are they, tacticians? Um, what are their skill sets? So I think a lot of what HR can do is to sort of reassure and establish kind of rules of engagement. Who gets copies of the report? Who doesn't get copies of the report? What are those minimums, and kind of establish what those guardrails are. Uh, and that's kind of key. I think a really good HR business partner can help a leader understand why this feedback is a good thing to get at this point in time. If you're dealing with kind of individual stuff, if you're doing broad organizational work, then that HR business partner can be a messenger, right? And can message across the organization again, why, value, all that sort of thing. And then I guess I would say on the back end, looking at group level data to understand what's going on in their work group and where they can support. Super, super helpful. But HR shows up differently in so many different organizations. You'd be surprised at how radically different HR is perceived and leveraged. And so it really depends a lot on how you're positioned, right? Are you positioned as a key strategic partner that people trust and will work with to understand and get value out of various HR practices? Or are you a, compliance person who is seen as a barrier to trying to get things done? And both of those exist. So it really is going to depend, I hate to say it, on how you're positioned. But ideally they're really able to communicate and land it and build some credibility around the process. That's the ideal.
Great. Well, again, thank you all so much for such wonderful questions. As you can see, we answer them. So next time you sign up, definitely ask your questions. Um, Reach out to us if you have individual questions about your organization that you want to talk to us about. That's what we love to do is talk 360s. So look out for a follow-up email from us. We're going to send out the slides and the recording, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.